Are you ready for? Are you ready for?
So today's video, we're going to talk about pallets and why pallets are important in Dead by Daylight. At the start of a trial, all pallets are in the upright position, meaning that both the survivors and the killers can pass through the area next to them without needing to interact with them. Killers are unable to interact with pallets in this state, but survivors have the option to pull it down and create an obstacle for the killer that can only be vaulted by the survivors. In most cases, Legion and Wesker both can vault pallets just like the survivors. As a survivor, you have a choice to be able to throw a pallet against a killer. This can slow the killer down if you stun them. It can also slow them down because it helps to extend your chase. When there is a dropped pallet, the killers will have an option to break that pallet, and they'll be stuck and locked in an animation of breaking the pallet either with their foot, their hand, or their weapon for about not quite 2.5 seconds. This momentarily obstructs their vision as the camera will tilt downwards towards the pallet while they are destroying it, giving the survivor some time to get out of sight, whether that's hiding or running away to the next tile. Early game and late game pallets. Throwing a pallet early in the match is okay, especially if you're having a really good chase, your teammates are doing gens, and you know you're going to have pallets at the end of the match. Not having pallets at the end of the match can absolutely cost you the game. Sometimes there's one gen to go and there's a teammate having a really great chase, but if they don't have any pallets to continue their chase, you're never going to pop that last gen. That teammate's going to get hooked pretty quickly and it's going to be the end of the match before you know it. It's good to try to remember at the top of the match while you are in chase to either greet a pallet until you are on the ground, meaning you never throw that pallet, or you have a nice long chase and you've dropped a pallet or two. But you do have to keep in mind as those chases go on early in the match, have I thrown a lot of pallets? Because if I have, then there's probably not a lot of pallets left for my teammates. And if there's not a lot of pallets left for my teammates for when they get in chase, then that pretty much guarantees that any pallets left up are going to get tossed. Whether they get left there by the killer and they don't get broken, the killer breaks them. It is very hard late game to be able to survive and have some escapes without pallets. You have pallets in all different places on the map. You have pallets in jungle gyms, and you have pallets in areas that are called filler pallets. Filler pallets are usually a little bit more safer. These loops are usually around low-lying items or objects like cars or crates and giant spools. You can see the killer more clearly over them, and you have more of a chance to survive a little longer in those loops. Pallets that are in jungle gyms are just as safe, but they can feel a little less safe because you can't see the killer at all times. You have walls that are very tall and it obstructs your vision around those corners. You also can't keep track of the killer's red stain as easy in these areas. So a lot of times while it is harder for the killer to get around those pre-dropped pallets in jungle gyms versus filler pallets can also be unsafe against killers like Huntress or Trickster or even somebody like Slinger. They can easily M2 you across those objects. In jungle gyms, pallets are a little safer because it usually forces the killer to have to break the pallet to continue, where in a filler pallet, they can more easily watch the survivor in which direction they're going as well, that they can make a decision if they decide to not break that pallet and continue after the survivor. But in a jungle gym, it's a little bit harder. They're going to want to break that pallet because they don't have line of sight of you and they don't want to lose the chase against you or that survivor. Learning when and when not to throw a pallet is something you have to think about while in chase. Sometimes taking the hit and just going right on by the pallet and leaving it up is the best choice. You have haste when you take a hit, so you're wasting that haste while you could possibly running away to another very safe tile. You could be wasting that haste by dropping a pallet and really only getting a few steps because maybe the killer doesn't even break the pallet. So often the killer knows what you're up to in those cases. They may or may not break the pallet. They may continue around the wall of the jungle gym or around the small filler tile and try to get you that way. If you've pre-dropped the pallet, you may have the chance to get away, but if you pre-drop that pallet and you're already injured, most likely the killer is not going to break the pallet and you're going to get down pretty quickly. Using that haste to get away is something that I think is more important than trying to get the pallet dropped. It matters at what point in the game it is when it comes to tossing pallets. Early on in the match, I try my best to not throw pallets to be able to keep them up for myself later or even my other teammates. If it's later in the match, I may not be so stingy with pallets. I probably will be more likely to greed them a little bit and toss them, even if I am injured. Being able to create some distance while I may be burning the haste, I'm hoping that the killer might break the pallet and I'll be able to get away. Getting away, whether that means escaping late game or if it means I just get to another jungle gym and potentially help my teammates by staying in chase. But if it is early on in the match, I will try to burn the haste to get to another tile rather than throwing the pallet. I think it is more beneficial 9 times out of 10, even if it is late game. It's hard not to let your muscle memory take over and throw that pallet. But early on in a match, I do really try to pay attention there the most about when I'm burning pallets. And if I feel like I've already thrown one pallet and it's 5 gens to go, I'm probably not going to throw another one. I'm going to just eat the down from the killer, whether I'm by a pallet or not. I don't think it's worth throwing too many pallets in the beginning of the match. I think it's worth taking the hook and essentially letting other people who might be better loopers than me too have the chance to greed pallets, or other survivors also have the chance while they're in chase to survive some of those chases. There are going to be times that you need to pre-drop a pallet and times when you shouldn't pre-drop a pallet. It also comes down to what kind of killer you're going against. Some killers you should pre-drop pallets against. Some killers you should not pre-drop pallets against. Pre-dropping a pallet creates a safe loop against certain killers. Sometimes you have to be able to continue around and mind game going left and right and back and forth in a jungle gym, a freestanding pallet, a filler pallet. There's plenty of opportunities that you can loop and greed pallets, but certain killers you do need to pre-drop against them. Certain killers like Mikey and Bubba, who can essentially one-shot you. Mikey has to hit his T3 power to do that, but it helps to create safe area, right? It helps to slow the killer down. It creates something else for the killer to do while you run away. You're hoping for 2 things when you pre-drop a pallet. You're hoping that the killer is going to have to spend the time to break the pallet, and it helps your teammates pop a gen or escape, get an exit gate done, or it helps you continue to get away and get into another loop. The other thing you're hoping with the pre-dropped pallet is that it's going to help you spend time in a loop that feels a little more safe. You have extra space on both sides of the pallet to be able to mind game the killer, and the killer is going to try to mind game you back. During that time, you're essentially just hoping that your teammates are doing objectives. The whole point of having pallets and mind gaming and looping is to essentially waste the killer's time for your other teammates, whether there's 3 of you alive, 2, or 1, spend time doing objectives. Greeting a pallet is probably one of my favorite things to do in a chase. Being able to greet a pallet is going to only help you make your chase last longer. While you're looping a killer in a loop, whether that is a filler pallet or a jungle gym, greeting a pallet, whether you hesitate right at the pallet as the killer is getting close to you, or maybe doing a small 360 right at the pallet, also can make the killer what we call the killer is respecting a pallet. The killer will back up and pull off the pallet. You do not throw the pallet and you continue around the loop. The killer will continue to chase you through that loop. The mind gaming will continue. But so often, killers do respect pallets and they will pull off. You may be able to do this 2 or 3 times in one chase at one pallet. There are times you have to gauge if the killer is going to be respectful of a pallet or not. Maybe you have already hesitated at a pallet and made the killer respect the pallet early on in the match, and now it's late game and the killer's not going to believe you. Being able to greet a pallet is a great way to extend your chase. So often the killer is going to respect the pallet probably once. It is rare that a killer will continue to M1 right on through that pallet. But at least you know early on in the match if that's going to happen. If you get good at greeting pallets, or at least think about greeting pallets while in chase early on in a match, you can really gauge how the killer is going to play from there on out. You'll know from there if you can even greet the pallet or not. Some killers never respect pallets. It's just a play style. Some killers are newer and they don't know how to gauge a survivor if they're going to throw the pallet or not. Some killers respect a pallet every single time. But it is a great way to learn how to see the signs on how a killer might play when it comes to pallets. So the next time you're out in the fog and you're facing off against your favorite killer, maybe think a little longer about which pallet you're going to throw or when you might want to throw that pallet. Think about a little more about your pre-drops and looping a downed pallet. Don't forget to greed, do a little 360, make me proud. But good luck next match. Have fun out there, and don't forget to use, and sometimes don't use, those pallets.